Beethoven's moment. A maestro's defiance in the spotlight. The opera house was a sea of golden light and velvet seats, a sacred place where music, emotion, and genius collided. The audience was still, hanging on every note that resonated through the towering, gilded walls. But in the midst of the grandeur, in the orchestra pit, and above all, in the man standing before them on the stage, there was a storm brewing. Ludwig van Beethoven, the man who had conquered the world with his symphonies, the man who defied the very limitations of music itself, was facing an audience that would never fully understand the depth of his genius. The symphony he had composed, his magnum opus, was ready for its premiere, but so was the reality of his condition. Beethoven had long since been deaf, yet his music spoke louder than any sound his ears could perceive. The challenges of his condition had shaped him into a figure both revered and misunderstood. As he stood at the front of the stage, bathed in the soft glow of the opera house's lights, the weight of his deafness felt almost inconceivable. His mind could hear the notes that no longer reverberated in his eardrums. His soul could feel the rhythm of the orchestra, but his ears were mute to it. Every note that filled the air was his, but he could not hear it. He could only see it, through the movement of the orchestra, through the flow of his symphony, through the energy of the audience, whose faces he could not make out, but whose presence he could feel. The audience was waiting. The tension in the room was palpable, thick enough to be felt in the very air they breathed. This was Beethoven's moment, his defiance of fate, his triumph over the silence that had been forced upon him. And yet, as he stood before them, the maestro felt a quiet roar of uncertainty wash over him. The faces of the musicians before him, his fellow performers, were set in concentration, each one knowing that what they were about to perform was not merely a piece of music. It was a statement, a declaration of resilience, of the triumph of spirit over body. Beethoven's gaze swept over the orchestra, his hand steadying the score in front of him, and with a sharp motion, he raised his baton. The opening notes of the symphony filled the space, carried by the power of strings, brass, and woodwinds. The conductor's hands moved with precision, guiding the musicians through a score that defied conventions, one that would change the landscape of classical music forever. Beethoven was the architect of something extraordinary, but in his heart, he knew that this piece, this symphony, was not just about musical innovation. It was about his survival, his insistence on continuing to create despite the obstacles that life had placed in his path. As the music swelled and pulsed through the theater, Beethoven felt the raw power of his creation. His heart beat in time with the rhythm, his body vibrating with each note. Though the sound of the orchestra reached no further than the limits of the pit, Beethoven's mind saw the music unfolding around him. He could feel the brilliance of his work even as he stood at the center of the stage, an island of silence in a sea of sound. It was his defiance, his rebellion against the world that had turned its back on him, against the deafness that had stilled his senses and nearly crushed his spirit. He knew what the world thought of him. This deaf composer, this stubborn genius who insisted on composing music that would be performed, that would be heard by others even though he himself could not hear it. There were whispers behind his back, questions about his mental state, doubts about his abilities, but he was used to it by now. Beethoven had never composed for approval. He composed for the truth that resided within him, the truth that he could not ignore, the truth that demanded to be heard, even if it had to be in silence. The music began to crescendo, building to the peak of the symphony's first movement. Beethoven's eyes closed for a moment, his brow furrowing as if trying to catch a fleeting sound, but there was nothing. He had learned to rely on the vibrations beneath his feet, the motion of the orchestra, the subtle shifts in the musician's expressions to guide him. He didn't need to hear to know that this symphony was everything he had poured his soul into for years. It was a defiance of the limitations imposed upon him, a declaration of his own indomitable will. As the music moved into its next section, Beethoven's body swayed, each movement in perfect harmony with the flow of the orchestra. His hands guided the strings, the horns, the woodwinds, his fingers trembling not from the uncertainty of the music, but from the sheer intensity of what he had achieved. To the audience, this was a performance like no other. They saw the brilliance of the composition, the mastery of the musicians, but what they couldn't see was the struggle behind the performance. What they couldn't understand was that the conductor standing before them, the man who seemed so powerful and sure in his movements, was silent inside. The performance reached its climax, and Beethoven's hands moved furiously, urging the musicians forward. His eyes were wide, his face intense as he willed the music to be heard, even if it couldn't reach his own ears. He had created this masterpiece, a symphony that transcended the silence of his own mind, a piece that would echo through the centuries long after he was gone. This was his victory, his final word to a world that had doubted him, that had questioned his abilities, his sanity. This symphony, this moment, was his defiance of everything that tried to hold him back. As the last notes reverberated in the hall, Beethoven lowered his baton, and the orchestra fell silent. The audience, who had been holding their breath throughout the entire performance, erupted into applause, their hands clapping in unison. They cheered for the man who had dared to defy the world, who had dared to create something that spoke beyond the limitations of the body, beyond the barriers of sound. But Beethoven didn't hear it. He couldn't hear the cheers. He only saw the rising of the hands, the movement of the people before him. He knew they were applauding, but it was not for him. It was for the music. He stood motionless for a moment, his face unreadable, before turning to leave the stage. He had given everything he had, and though he couldn't hear the recognition, he knew it was there. He had triumphed, not over his deafness, but over the idea that it could silence him. Beethoven's music would forever be a testament to the power of the human spirit, to the defiance of silence, and to the belief that genius cannot be confined to the limits of the body. The opera house stood still, the audience still applauding, as if unwilling to let go of the magic that had just unfolded before them. And Ludwig van Beethoven, the man who had composed the impossible, disappeared into the shadows, an enigma, a genius, and a maestro who would forever stand as a beacon of defiance in the face of adversity.